Hello, everyone. This is my podcast introduction to this week's program, Rebuilding Trust in American Institutions, my conversation with Dr. Yuval Levin of the American Enterprise Institute. So as we start to think about the 250th birthday of the country, coming on July 4th, 2026, I think we all fear that this is going to be a period of the culture wars on steroids, that the right is going to accuse the left of apologizing for America and indoctrinating our children to hate this country, and the left is going to say it's been racism, sexism, misogyny, environmental catastrophe from the very beginning. We can hope it's better than that. Certainly great scholarship is being contemplated. Ken Burns is doing a set of films on the 250th birthday, but I'm afraid that this is going to play out along sort of predictable lines. I hope not. Anyway, I've been looking for people, scholars, thinkers, humanists, scientists, political figures, who want to talk about this, who want to talk about the funk that we're in and how we might claw our way out of it. And so I was attracted to his books. There are a bunch of them, but the ones that I have read are The Fractured Republic, which 2016 tells you sort of where we are, and A Time to Build, how recommitting to our institutions can revive the American dream. I recommend those books. We had a wide-ranging conversation about how we got here. His view is that nostalgia for a kind of a golden age after World War II is a mistake, that even though there's some truth to that nostalgia, that was not a characteristic or normal period in American history, and we sort of got spoiled into thinking that settlement of those decades was capable of being perpetuated. And now we're seeing that things are coming apart in all sorts of really interesting but frightening ways. He's an extraordinary scholar. It was great fun and honor to talk with him today, and I want to share this with you. I'll be looking for people, and if you know of people, recommend them to me. Books to read as we get ready for the 250th birthday. People to interview. Ideas to contemplate. Are we as bad off as we seem, or are we actually doing well enough? And can we somehow back away from the brink of our nihilism and the sort of incessant bickering and find something like a new national consensus? Is every election the most important election in American history? And we both agreed sort of not to talk about Donald Trump because we see him as kind of an outlier. One of the reasons I'm undertaking this 2.5-year Airstream trek around the country. I'm going to take my Airstream and my pickup and go to the national parks and the national forests and the national monuments and the presidential libraries. I'm going to interview Steinbeck scholars. I'm going to follow the Lewis and Clark Trail. I'm going to examine Theodore Roosevelt's footprint in the American West. I'm going to just meet random people along the lines of Charles Kuralt's America or William Least Moon's Blue Highways. My goal is to get out there and to listen, and to try to clear my mind of preconceptions and see what the American people's mood is at this point, and to see all the zany creativity of this extraordinary nation. There's so many interesting things going on in America that get almost no media attention because we're in this sort of doom and gloom period of national, I'd say, imaginative bankruptcy. So that's the program today. Yuval Levin, and the book to read is A Time to Build, How Recommitting to Our Institutions Can Revive the American Dream. I hope you're enjoying this. I hope you agree with me that we are in trouble as a people and that we need to talk about this, and it needs to be done in a thoughtful, dispassionate way, that we don't need to argue, we need to talk. We need to listen to each other, and we need to regard every point of view as having some legitimacy, even if we disagree with it. Jefferson's famous statement, or his quotation from Voltaire, I disagree with what you say, but I shall defend to the death your right to say it. Or as Jefferson liked to put it, we disagree, but we disagree as rational friends. That's certainly how I think we need to go about this, and we need to be a lot more respectful of points of view that are not our own. And so my goal is to really bring all of that to you, and I hope that you will be glad that I'm doing that heavy lifting on behalf of all of our listeners. and all of your thoughts about the direction of the work that we're doing. And if you can contribute financially, it's going to be expensive. This is not me just sitting in a studio any longer. And so if you can help, I'll be immensely grateful, because I think this is going to be worth it. If you go to the website, ltamerica.org, I just have a piece that I've posted about John Donne, a new biography and treatment of the poetry and the sermons of John Donne. Let's go to the program. Yuval Levin, Rebuilding Trust in American Institutions. Thanks for listening, everyone. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Listening to America. I'm Clay Jenkinson. As we approach the 250th birthday of the American Republic, I'm talking to all the extraordinary minds I can about where we are, how we got here, and where we're headed. And today, I have the honor of having a conversation with Yuval Levin, who, among other things, is the Director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, a contributing editor to National Review, and a founding editor of National Affairs, the author of a number of books, The Great Debate in 2014, Edmund Burke, Thomas Paine, and the Birth of the Right and Left, Tyranny of Reason, 2001, Imagining the Future, 2008, more recently A Fractured Republic, Renewing America's Social Contract in the Age of Individualism, and most recently in 2020, A Time to Build, How Reconnecting to Our Institutions Can Revive the American Dream. That's an enormous amount of writing. So I've read your books, and I've gained a great deal from them. So my question is, how did we get here? In 1960, people, presidency, for Congress, for the media, for churches, for a whole range of key American institutions, for the police, for law and order, the judiciary, the Supreme Court. And now, as you know, the change is vast and really depressing. What happened?
Well, I guess I would begin by being a little careful about grounding our concerns about the present in a nostalgia for a particular moment in the past. So, to the question, how did we get here, when we start by measuring ourselves against the America of the immediate post-World War II moment, we should also ask how we got there. That moment, the 1950s and early 60s, really was an unusual moment in American life, a moment of unusual confidence in leaders and in institutions, private and public. And in that moment, Americans really did exhibit an extraordinary level of trust and belief in people in authority. I think that if you looked at American life in the 19th century, almost at any point, even putting aside the crazy 1860s, which obviously were distinct, you would find a country much more like ours than like that post-World War II moment. You'd find a society with a lot of trouble gathering confidence in itself and in its institutions, a dynamic place, a place undergoing a lot of change, and growing in some important ways, but changing in any case, and a place filled with a kind of suspicion of authority, a very great and powerful populist movement in its politics, striving at the same time also to be a developed modern democracy with functional institutions. I think in that particular respect, the America of the 21st century certainly has come down from the highs of self-confidence and trust of the post-World War II moment, but it is in a place we've seen before in some respects. Now, it's important that this was a coming down. We did experience that America. That was not imaginary. It was very real, and we have experienced the decline from that moment over a long stretch now, at least a half century, of falling trust and growing animosity and polarization in our society. So it is worth asking how we got here, but I just wouldn't take the America of the 1950s, early 60s to be a norm. And I think how we got here has had to do with a fragmentation of what was an exceptionally strong mainstream consensus in American life in the middle of the 20th century. That fragmentation was driven in part by some good things, by growing cultural diversity in our society, by more openness and a liberalization of our social life, which I think has been good on net, though it has come with costs. It's also been the result of a parallel liberalization in our economy, which also I think has been good on net, but has come with real costs. it is in that sense the opposite side of the coin of a liberalizing society. We are here at a moment where that cost is really being felt. The absence of solidarity, the absence of commonality, the absence of of a mainstream consensus is our reality in some pretty painful ways.
I take your point, and in your most recent books, you warn us about nostalgia, and you say that the right feels a nostalgia for that very period, thinking that it was sort of Ozzie and Harriet's America, a simpler time, more law and order, less vulgarity, etc. And the left thinks of the Great Society and the post-World War II liberal settlement in the world arena, and advancing progressivism, the Kennedy years, the Johnson years, even the Nixon years. And so they're looking at the same era, both feeling nostalgic, but for decidedly different reasons.
That's right. And they're both right in a sense, which means that what they look back to is a time that was both good and bad, from their different perspectives. I think when you look at the culture of mid-century America, you do see a lot of consensus and cohesion, but you also see a lot of resistance to conformity. That consensus, that cohesion, didn't always feel great to the people involved. It didn't feel great to people at the margins of American society. And it also didn't feel great to a lot of the people in that mainstream who felt like they were being coerced into a kind of consensus they didn't share in. There was a deep desire for liberalization, whether it be economic or cultural, and it came, and here we are.
A consensus they didn't share in. I think of one of North Dakota's greatest sons, Eric Severide, 3 times a week, speaking on the CBS Evening News, a somewhat left of center view, but there was no counter voice at the time except on the margins of AM radio. Suddenly, with Rush Limbaugh and the rise of Fox News and the echo chambers of the siloed media, you get not only a counter voice, but a very powerful, enraged counter voice. And so I think when we think of those years, I think people who are progressives or liberals think that was America, but it was really just the establishment's America, wasn't it?
That's right. There was a kind of establishment consensus. There were not a lot of alternative voices out there. Now, the establishment was relatively center left, and it was pretty responsible, too. It has to be said. I say that as a conservative. I mean, it really was. But nonetheless, it felt stifling to a lot of people who were not represented. A lot of what we now feel as fragmentation and breakdown is actually just greater representation of a broader variety of voices. It certainly feels less like a consensus, but it has to be said that representation is very important in a democratic society, and that kind of fragmentation may be more true to American reality.
Per that, do you think that the magnitude of the right's critique is partly compensatory for having been stifled for decades, and suddenly when it got a chance to voice its rage, it really has a lot to get off its chest?
Well, it's an interesting thing. I mean, I think at some level that's surely true, but the feeling within that world of the right is not that that whole period was a time of oppression and now we get to be free. It's actually more like that period was a better time for America, and now we're falling off the cliff. It's a worry about the present much more than it is a kind of expression of long restrained rage. And so I think in some ways, both sides of our politics now are reacting to a sense of alarm and panic about the present and the immediate future, a sense that the country is out of control. I think they come to it in different ways. They feel it in somewhat different ways. They express it differently. But in both cases, one of the things it does is that it keeps our politics from being future oriented. It's very hard for people to imagine America in 2050. Everybody thinks between now and then there's going to be some kind of calamity because the wrong people are in charge. Our politics is having a lot of trouble building what America is going to need 30 years from now because we can only think short term. We think the next election is do or die, and that's no way to live.
Agreed. Depending on the polls, more than 70% of the American people say that the country is heading in the wrong direction. Of course, that means that they don't see the same set of problems. I think deliberate caricatures can't be doing us much good, right?
The interesting thing about that is that those are coming at a moment when our politics is basically stuck at 50-50, so that neither side is likely to do anything, whatever it wants. Even if it wants to destroy the country, All we have now are very, very close elections. And yet, it is in this moment of unusually, really historically unusual, long stretch of close elections without a majority party. We've not had a majority party in America since the 1990s. And yet, both sides of our politics feel like they're losing every battle and the country's getting dragged in the opposite direction. It is that very deadlock that makes people feel as though the temperature of our politics is higher, the stakes are higher, and every election matters more than ever.
Your warning about nostalgia, when I read it, it's one of those insights that you don't have until you hear it, and then you say, well, duh, of course. How did you come to it? I mean, tell us how you formulated this approach.
Well, I'll tell you, I am a Gen Xer. I'm 46 years old, and I'm a political scientist. I spent a lot of my time thinking about working in the kind of communitarian political science world that has been dominated by the very important work of people like Bob Putnam and by books like Coming Apart, Charles Murray, or Putnam's own book, Bowling Alone, and his later ones. It occurred to me at a certain point that all those books had something in common. They all begin by describing as a norm the America of the author's youth. Putnam does this explicitly, and he's very open about it, and I think he acknowledges that there are limitations to this. Bob Putnam, I often disagree with him, but he's a very, very honest political scientist. He's he's really a model of honesty and scholarship. And what they say is, look at America in 1960, and look at how our capacity for community has declined since that time. Now, that's true. It has. But America in 1960 is not when time began. And as you say, it's one of these things where once you notice it, you realize this just happens everywhere. And it really struck me in the 2012 presidential election. I listened to both conventions, and over, speech after speech, you had people born in the 1940s, who were in charge and power in 2012 rather naturally, talking about the 1950s as the American norm and describing a decline from that time. And once you see that, you begin to think it through a little bit and realize, first of all, everybody who's in power in every one of our institutions in that moment came from that generation. That's been true for an unusually long time. I'll give you an example. The Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Donald Trump, who were president over 25 years, and I exclude Barack Obama from this because he is younger than them. The three of them were born at the same time. I mean, they were born within 5 weeks of each other. They're the same generation precisely. Over and over, the story we have of ourselves is a story of that period. It's a story that begins in the 1950s, the 70s and 80s as young adults. By now, we're kind of, a little disoriented about where's America heading. This isn't the country I know. We think about our own history as though we, too, were born in the summer of 1946.
And we need to take a short break. I'm sorry to interrupt. When we come back, I want to ask you more about nostalgia and how we can break the addiction to nostalgia. I'm talking to Yuval Levin. This is Listening to America. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to this special edition of Listening to America. I'm having a great conversation with Yuval Levin, author of many books, most recently A Time to Build and The Fractured Republic. To follow up on what you were saying, when I read your most recent books, you talk about this very issue that people at both ends of the spectrum idealized the 50s and 60s, and they almost say the same things. Kids could ride their bikes in the town would look after your children, things were safe. Systems worked. They're creating a utopia that never was. It's what's surprising is how both ends of the spectrum seem to agree on that part of it, at least if these are white commentators.
That's very important too. And I also think that there is a way in which that moment after the Second World War, some of what they say is surely true. It was a very unusual moment when the United States commanded the world economy in a way that really is absolutely unrepeatable, and when it really was possible to support a family pretty comfortably on one income, when growth was galloping and all that, that was a very odd moment. And we cannot align our expectations to that very unusual situation, even if what they say is true. And I think that in some respects it is at least incomplete. The standard of living of 21st century America is much higher than it was in 1950. You would not want to live in poverty in 1950. Even living in poverty in 2023 is far far better. And of course, as you say, you would not want to be a Black American in 1950. And there are a lot of other parts of our society where you would much rather live today than then. But this nostalgia is a very, very powerful force across our political spectrum.
How do we break the addiction? Because you say we're not going to be able to formulate the future if we stay wallowing in this nostalgia.
Well, look, I think some of it is generational transition. I mean, it is strange that our leaders are still people born in the 1940s. It may well be that we're galloping into another election here where we're going to choose between two people who are going to be 80 years old in the job. Generational transition is one way to help ourselves out of that particular kind of nostalgia. There has to be a greater future orientation to our politics. We have to have a politics that asks, what is our country going to need a generation from now that it doesn't have now? A lot of our catastrophism makes it impossible for us to ask that question. We're thinking, how do we survive the next 5 minutes? Because if that guy wins the election, we're not going to make it. Well, that's not true. And it's keeping us from seeing that there are things we could be doing to make this country stronger in a generation that we're simply not doing because we can't pay attention to the future.
We do seem to be kind of stuck in a very dangerous gerontocracy at the moment, and Mitch McConnell is having blackouts in public. It's clear that Joe Biden has lost a step or two. It's hard to know exactly what that means, and Donald Trump is just Donald Trump. But when I see Justin Trudeau or Macron on the world stage, it's not that I want their politics, but I would like their youth and vigor.
Yeah, look, I think if you look at America's governors today, you see the kind of people who should be in our national politics, but somehow are not. Jared Polis, the governor of Colorado, just won re-election with a 25-point margin. I don't agree with him about a lot. That's a political leader, right? He's 45 or so and very energetic, has a lot of ideas. Ron DeSantis, maybe you don't agree with him about anything, but he's 45 or so, has a lot of energy, a lot of ideas. He's somebody who's thinking about the future. I think we've got to start pulling our political leadership from those ranks. There are plenty of such people, and they have a lot of ambition, but somehow here we are still.
All right, so you've warned us correctly about nostalgia, and yet you say the fractured republic and a time to build, how recommitting to our institutions can revive the American dream. When we get to this point of disillusionment, how then do you begin to dig out?
Yeah, I think that it's the very fact that we've reached a point where a lot of people are willing to say, this can't continue. Very few Americans now would say, things are going great in our politics. Let's just keep doing this. We're forced to ask ourselves, well, what could we be doing differently? And it is very important, I think, when facing that question, to force ourselves to think in terms of institutions, because that doesn't come naturally to us as Americans. We tend to think in terms of individuals. A lot of what is failing us and what is broken down has to do with the institutions of our society, the forms of our common life, the ways in which we act together. Institutions from those closest to us, from the family, the school, the church, all the way to the institutions of our national politics. The way in which institutions can enable us to live better lives is by forming us in the direction of common efforts, by shaping individuals to take a part in a joint effort with others. And a lot of our institutions are just plainly failing to do that. They're functioning now more like platforms for individuals, a place to stand, to raise your profile, to elevate yourself individually, than as ways of giving us a role in relation to others that lets us achieve something together. The loss of public trust in institutions speaks of an underlying decline in the trustworthiness of institutions. And when we think about what to fix, we have to look to institutional structures, not just to individual behavior.
Well said. We're on the other side of Vietnam. We're on the other side of the Pentagon Papers, the other side of Watergate, the other side of the Church Committee hearings, etc., etc. There's been a lot of good reason for disillusionment in the last generation or two. And I hear you, but how do you then bring a renewal to those institutions? I absolutely agree on your diagnosis. I just don't understand how we do it.
In political and social science, everybody is a radiologist. Diagnosis is much easier than prescription, and people are much better at it than we are at prescription.
Yeah, but if you write a book called A Time to Build, you're begging for this question.
Exactly. I'm forcing myself to be put in a situation of being asked this question, and that's intentional, but it doesn't mean I have the right answer. I think the answer begins by recognizing that institutional trust is a function of people's willingness to be shaped by the institutions they're part of. To say, when you face a core decision to say, what's my role here? And given the role I have, how should I make this decision? Not just what do I want, not just how do I personally want to be seen, but as a parent or as a member of this community or as a worker or an employer, what should I be doing here? Allowing the institutional role and responsibility to shape yourself a little more. I would say that oftentimes the people we're most disappointed with in American life are people who are obviously failing to do that. We find ourselves asking, how could she do that? She's a teacher, right? He's the president of the United States. How could he think that that's something you can say? And the fact is, they're not asking that question. They're not thinking that way. Now, look, you can't force other people to do that. You have to begin by forcing yourself to do that. And in moments of decision, by asking yourself, given the role I've got here, how should I behave? But that also then has to translate into demanding that of other people in your life and ultimately of other people in your society, so that there's a price to be paid when you're a politician who just simply doesn't care what the role of a member of Congress or a governor really is. There's a price to be paid when you're a CEO who just doesn't care what the responsibility of leadership really entails. I think right now there is no price to be paid in too many of our institutions. And on the contrary, there are great advantages to behaving as though you're completely unbounded and unrestrained. What a lot of these people in authority don't see is that behaving as though you're unrestrained is exactly how you lose trust. Trust is a function of two things above all, of demonstrated competence, the sense that you can do your job, and of demonstrated restraint, the sense that you will not abuse your power. I think today in America, a lot of the loss of trust we've seen is a function of the latter, of a sense that people in power are unrestrained and they will not stop. They are not constrained by any sense of obligation to anybody else. And the people in charge of a lot of our institutions, and just we have to say, a lot of us as individuals, behave as though we are unconstrained and therefore make ourselves much harder to trust.
And this is such a dense problem. So, for example, it's easy to criticize Donald Trump. He's kind of an outlier, I think. I don't think that he really represents any political norm in America. So I don't want to get stuck on him. But I think, for example, of Barack Obama, a much better human being, I would say.
Yes.
But if he starts governing by executive order, which is not a constitutionally based power of the president, then there are people who can rightly say, that's just not okay. We get your frustrations. We know you have a pen and a cell phone, but you don't have the power to do major things in the United States without the legislative process. And if we were a republic, we would have checked that. And so now we're in this position where a routine politician on the right will say, when I get to Washington on day one, I'm going to balance the budget. Well, first of all, what an idiotic thing to say. But when they can't, then the people who put them there become increasingly disillusioned, and suddenly you wind up with Marjorie Taylor Greene because it's anarchy. It's Steve Bannon's world. Let's just tear the whole damn thing down.
I think it's exactly right. And it describes the rhetoric of a political culture that is unconstrained by institutional structures, so that people run for office and speak in ways that have no relation to the office they're running for. You run for Congress and say, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, or I'm never going to give an inch to the other side. Well, you're running for an office where the job is kind of to give an inch in order to get an inch. That's the job. And so if you're running for Congress and saying you're never going to do it, well, you're telling me you're never going to do your job. Plenty of jobs where you can get far by being a stubborn jerk. This one just isn't one of them. But a lot of our political culture now consists of people who are not constrained or shaped or formed by those institutional obligations. The absence of a sense of what the institutions are and what the roles involved in them are is a big part of what's gone wrong in our political culture. The trouble is, it's also evident in our larger culture. It's also something that you see kind of breaking down of the wall between politics and the rest of society in a way that makes it extremely difficult to trust people, so that we think that the people who run the police department or who are in charge of public health are also doing politics. All of them are also just in the business of advancing a political agenda. And that makes it hard to trust all of them, too. And the decline in trust, I think, has a lot to do with this breakdown of people's sense of what their institutional roles really are.
Was there a time when most politicians were more in line with civic engagement, civic virtue, willing to tell something like the truth, not making wild-ass claims that they know when they utter them cannot come to pass? Was there a time when we had a higher quality in our political culture?
Well, so yes. Now I want to be careful. I mean, there's always been a lot to complain about in American politics. There's never been a shortage of that. But I think that we have tended to be more self conscious about what gets rewarded in American politics than we are now. The American Constitution is very careful about structuring incentives. It doesn't assume that people are going to be good. That's not a safe bet, and it's not true. But it does, therefore, try to structure institutions in ways that reward better behavior and punish worse behavior. The American electorate has generally been willing to play that role too, so that usually, not always, but usually, voters have tended not to reward antisocial behavior in our politics. I think part of the breakdown we've seen is that voters are much more willing to reward that kind of behavior now. And some of the incentive structures have changed. They've just fundamentally changed in practical ways. I think the adoption of primaries in our presidential selection process, for example, changed the incentives pretty dramatically that confront politicians. The weakening of the parties have generally acted as selection mechanisms. And as they've grown weaker, they've just become brands now, the two parties. There aren't really people sitting around saying, well, who should be our candidate? That's been left to a broad electorate that thinks very differently about what it takes to win and what matters. Our standards are much lower now in American politics than they've been for most of our history. There's just no way around that. It's hard to avoid nostalgia and making that kind of argument, but look, at some level, there's been a decline that has to be addressed.
I watched the first debate in the Republican primary last week. You saw Nikki Haley and Christie both behave like what we would regard as responsible politicians. She said, "You're not going to get an abortion ban through Congress, so why are we talking that way?" And Christie was saying, let's be realistic. Let's talk about what's possible. Let's not play this game anymore. And you saw the establishment attempt to put the crown on Jeb Bush in 2016, and that collapsed in what can only be regarded as sort of almost a national farce. So it's clear that the electorate is willing, and maybe wanting to hear the more extreme positions, and they are not rewarding someone like Chris Christie, who I think, for all of his faults, is a highly responsible sort of politician.
Yeah, I think that's right, and it has to do with this question of the place of institutions in our political life. Because I heard Christie speak to a crowd about a month ago now, where the interviewer asked him, "How do you think about the two big challenges we face now, the collapse of education policy and crime?" And he said, "Well, these are both important, but I'm running for president. And the president doesn't actually have anything to do with education policy or crime." The answer was extremely unpopular in the
And
crowd.
refreshing.
Yeah, it was great. I thought it was wonderful. Yes, he knows what job he's running for and what that actually involves. I will tell you that it was not well received. And people do want to hear about those things. And they're basically looking for a presidential candidate who will be a kind of commentator on the issues that they most want to hear about on television, rather than someone who will fill the particular role with its distinct character that is created by our particular system of government for which he's running. And
I'm a Jeffersonian, and I know your view would be, I think, that Jefferson was overly optimistic about the human project. As a Jeffersonian, I believe that the people have to hold their government accountable. They have to punish demagoguery and mere rhetoric and corruption. They don't seem to be doing that. In what sense does an 18-year-old in this country graduating from Yale or from a community college in Indianapolis have a social contract? Most people today seem to think, "What have you done for me lately?" when they look at government.
I think the problem we face is a function of both a top-down and a bottom-up process. And the two are naturally related in a democracy, so that the quality of leadership we have in our society is too low. And I think some of that is a function of structural and institutional problems that could be addressed by reform kind of things. But some of it is also just a function of what the public actually wants, which is harder to change in those ways, and which has to be addressed by, frankly, almost a kind of moralism, a set of arguments made by people who are taken seriously about how we should think of ourselves as citizens. That latter kind of change is harder. In a democratic society, it's hard to make a moral argument to the public about civic virtue. It's hard to tell people that they ought to be more responsible. The natural reaction to that is, well, who the hell are you? A lot of times that's a healthy reaction, frankly, and it's an important part of our democratic culture. But I think we're at a point where there's enough agreement that something is wrong, that something is broken, that there is room now to think about both kinds of change, about some structural change. I would think, for example, about changes to the primary system, the kinds of incentives that confront our politicians. The question is, how do we create incentives to do better? And I do think that election rules and some of those kinds of structural changes in Congress and other things can be part of the solution. But without question, there's also a necessity for thinking about responsibility when we think about our place in society. The responsibility we have to one another, the responsibility our leaders should have. Responsibility is a really wonderful American word. You know, if you look it up in the Oxford English Dictionary, some of the first uses they can find in the English language are in James Madison's notes on the Constitutional Convention. He almost had to create this term to describe what they were talking about. And, you know, we have to live that out. Responsibility is a combination of taking ownership and of being accountable. And that's exactly what's required in a democracy. This is our country, and its future is our future. And so we can't just sit around with our arms folded and wait for somebody else to show up and do better. We're the ones who have to do better. When I make that case, do people just nod their head and say, yeah, I need to do better? No, that's not what happens. But I think you have to hope that it gets through. You have to try to do that yourself in your own life and set some kind of example. And I also do believe, I'm enough of a Jeffersonian to believe that most Americans actually do want better than this, want a better life for their children, and would like this country to be in a better place than it is. And we're lacking a sense of how that could happen. But if we had a better grasp on what we could do to improve our prospects, I think a lot of people would be willing to be at least a little more responsible as citizens.
I couldn't agree with you more. That I think most Americans are optimistic, more earnest than they get credit for, and I think our media has really created a very dangerous, distorting lens and makes us feel that we're in the end times, that this is the Roman Republic circling the drain. We need to take another short break. When we come back, I want to ask you about the Supreme Court. This is a special edition of Listening to America. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to this special edition of Listening to America. I'm having a really rich conversation with Yuval Levin, author of many books, the director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, contributing editor to the National Review, and a founding editor of National Affairs. I want to look at the court. So, if you think of the institutions that have plummeted in trust over the past 40 years, the press, we get that. Congress, we get that. It used to be that the church and the Supreme Court and policing were regarded as sort of the things that still had some traction for American respect. In the last few years, the Supreme Court has really taken a hit here. We have an interesting constitution that says that certain questions have to be resolved by these 9 unelected beings, and we dress them up in robes. We make sure that we do all the accoutrements of majesty and reverence to give them a little bit more authority than they might otherwise have if they were in sweats and blue jeans. But now that we're seeing some really serious conflict of interest, refusals to recuse, the court has really now lost a lot of its luster, and it now appears to many, many Americans as just the third branch of our political system and no longer anything like what the founders had in mind. It sure feels like there's been some serious loss here. How do you see it?
Yeah, I think that's right. I would say the courts are still more respected than most of our institutions. Where congressional approval is at around 12%, the court's approval often is at about 50%. The trouble is it's a different 50 every few years. The reason for that is exactly what you describe, which is that we think of the court now in terms of how do we feel about the outcomes of its decisions, rather than is it deciding cases based on the law and the facts. And so the court has unquestionably, I think, become more politicized over the past generation or two. I think part of what we're seeing is a function of the court taking up questions that don't really belong on the list of those questions that ought to be settled by the court. Broadly speaking, courts should resolve disputes about what the law is, not what it should be. In the abstract, everybody agrees with that. But when it comes to really hard cases, there are a lot of people on both sides of our politics who think that it would sure be useful if a court majority agreed with them and we didn't actually have to go through the political process. We could just get it done right now and nobody could argue. For a long time, the courts were dominated by the left, and the left felt this way and tried to resolve various disputes that should have been resolved democratically instead judicially, and the right resented that and made all kinds of arguments about judicial restraint. Now the court is dominated by the right, and suddenly you find a lot of people on the right saying, well, let's just resolve this in the courts. And I think the left is gradually discovering the beauty of judicial restraint. I think judicial restraint is the right approach, whichever side has a majority, and that the reason for that is that judicial restraint leaves the key questions of what the law should be to the legislature. It leaves them to Congress above all. And Congress is where those questions should be resolved. I think a lot of the problem that we face on that front, and the reason why the court finds itself in these positions, is actually the fault of Congress. Congress has been derelict in its own use of its own powers, and over has passed laws that make broad delegations of power, and then leaves it to the executive branch to figure out what to do with them, and then leaves it to the courts to decide if that's acceptable. And both the executive branch and the court, therefore, find themselves in an impossible situation where they are asked to do things that they are not equipped to do. I think sometimes the Supreme Court is too willing and eager to do those things, but sometimes it also has really no choice. I don't think the court is more corrupt today than it used to be. I don't think it's about not recusing. I don't think it's about having rich friends. I think it's about making decisions that are fundamentally political and therefore making it impossible to trust the institution, which is supposed to be outside of those kinds of political boundaries.
I agree with you. There's kind of a fundamental misunderstanding of the tripartite system of our Constitution. Congress is meant to wrestle with the problems of the country, and the court is trying to decide whether this fits within the constitutional settlement and the amendments that have come afterwards. And so, for example, if you take the Navajo case, the Navajo water case that was recently decided, I know so many people who are liberals who say that's a terrible decision because we have a moral duty to get water to the Navajo. And my view was, well, maybe, but the court's trying to figure out what the treaty requires the Constitution to deliver under the utmost good faith clause of the Northwest Ordinance and so on. And so I think the people want the courts to do justice balls and strikes when that's not the function of the court.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely right. And that limited role of the court is frustrating because the court is the most functional of our institutions. It actually just makes decisions. When a decision is made by a messy compromise in Congress, it is more legitimate than when it is made by a clean and carefully argued court decision. And we should want Congress to make more of those decisions and the courts to make fewer of them.
I've heard your diagnosis is outstanding, and your capacity to reason about what we need is, I think, spot on. But I haven't heard a mechanism, a practical set of mechanisms. Is it better civics education in our schools? What will move us off this time of cynicism, paralysis, and disillusionment?
I think that's a fair point. And first of all, I would say that what's needed to begin with is a desire to address this problem and a sense of what the problem is. And so diagnosis does have to precede prescription. Secondly, that the core mechanism for addressing the kinds of political challenges that we've been talking about, to my mind, is the American Constitution. We have allowed ourselves to depart from constitutional practice in some very dangerous ways in modern America, and both parties do this. So that part of what's required for addressing these problems is a restoration of constitutional practice, putting Congress at the center of the system again, allowing it to function again in ways that actually promote cross-partisan bargaining and accommodation. Beyond politics, I think a lot of what's required really is a kind of cultural transformation that has to begin with personal transformation. I think we have to see these problems as our problems, as belonging to us, and as resulting from our own misbehavior and irresponsibility. We have to both practice responsibility and demand it. A lot of what's missing is seeing that the problem is not them, but us. I'm an immigrant to the United States. I was born in Israel. My family came here when I was very young. I grew up in the US, but I'm a naturalized citizen. I became a citizen in 1996. I was 19 years old. The federal judge who gave us the oath of citizenship made a little speech. And what he said was very simple. He said, from now on, you have to talk about America in terms of we and us and not them and there. And that's it. That's all he said. I distinctly recall being disappointed with that speech. I thought he might quote Lincoln or something. But here I am, 25 years later telling you about it because I think it is profoundly important for us to remember that message, that when we talk about our country, we have to talk in terms of us and we. We have to take responsibility and ownership for it. I think we are really failing to do that in contemporary America. And it's true, that doesn't add up to a simple list of things we have to do. It's not a policy agenda exactly, but it's the kind of change of mindset that I think we have to start with.
And you say, I think you're sort of edging towards a spiritual change, a kind of almost a change of consciousness or basic spiritual orientation. Do you see anyone in the sort of panoply of our national political culture who is at least teasing out that set of ideas?
Well, I think there are some people in our politics who are open to thinking this way and are trying in various ways to do it. I would think about, for example, some politicians who do talk about country in more hopeful ways. When I watched that debate, I noticed Nikki Haley. I think Tim Scott is also an example of that. I think there are some younger politicians on the left as well. I mentioned Jared Polis, who is a Democratic governor of Colorado. These are not the most prominent people in our politics, but they're people who are speaking very frankly about what they think is wrong in a way that I think has real power to move people and to change souls. But is there a leader who can really catch fire? I don't think I've seen that person yet in 21st century America.
Where will this spiritual reawakening come? I think you're going to say it'll start in the individual and work its way out.
Well, in some ways, maybe, but I also think that you have to look for where there is demand, where there is hunger. And I think that at the moment, you have to look to the culture of younger Americans. You have to look at college campuses. There's a tremendous moral hunger among Americans who are under 30 right now. And look, I don't know exactly how to reach them. I wouldn't pretend to know. I don't think running for president is the way to do it. And, if you're going to run for president, run for mayor first and do something else. So I'm critical of her in that way, but I think that you have to think about where to deliver that message. That's the right question. And to me, the answer has to begin with younger Americans. I'm really struck, in some ways, younger Americans in our politics are some of the craziest people in America. I mean, it's not the healthiest place, but that is a function of the fact that there's a desire for a different way forward. And I think you've got to see that desire as a starting place and look for ways to speak to it.
I do agree, the young people are hungry to talk about life with a capital L. They're hungry to talk about what America is, what America's place in the world should be, how much material luxury can we have and still save the planet, and so on. I'm afraid, however, that at our most elite universities, the faculty are leftists who are taking those really earnest and important energies and saying, and I'll tell you what, you need to attack Ann Coulter. I'll tell you what, they're fascists on the right. And so instead of finding a way to leaven that into sort of citizenship, the leftist faculties, which are in control of all the elite institutions, are leading young people down a path of social justice activism rather than inquiry.
I very much agree with that. But I think that leaves open an opportunity that is not being treated as an opportunity by the opponents of those leftist professors. Those opponents instead are just devoting their time to criticizing the leftist professors, and that's fine. But you have to offer an alternative. I think a lot of the students of those professors know that what they're getting is thin gruel, that this is not an answer to the question I'm asking. They're not getting any other answer. And that's the real failure.
I remember Ray Charles singing America with a giant flag rippling in the background, and, speeches about American exceptionalism, the greatness of this country, the golden fields of wheat in the West and our mountains, and this people that have come together from every country and every religious persuasion and have come together to produce this extraordinary experimental civilization. It was beautiful. It might have been partial, but it was beautiful. When I look at what's coming, I see 1619 Project on one hand and Lee Greenwood's God Bless the USA on the other, and just people shouting at each other for a year and a half. What do you see?
I have that same worry. I think that I sort of happen to be in a place where I'm able to do something about it, and I'm part of a group here where I work at the American Enterprise Institute that's trying to use the 250th as an opportunity to create a 21st century literature on the American founding, to be used in civic education, to be used in general as a way of elevating the conversation some, because precisely the worry you describe is the worry I have, which is that we have two options for how to talk about America, and they're both much too simple. I think that we have to use the opportunity of the 250th to ask ourselves who we are and who we mean to be. And in some ways, that was done successfully in 1976. Look, 1976 was not a high point in American civilization. There was a lot wrong. There was also a crisis of confidence in America in those years. And not everything about the bicentennial celebrations was great, but there was a genuine engagement with the American founding that lasted. I mean, I'd say we're used to there being a lot of popular books about founders and the founding that actually really only began around the bicentennial. The idea that people would be reading biographies of John Adams would have been bizarre in 1970. It was not bizarre by 1980. And the reason is really a concerted effort to use the bicentennial as an opportunity to think seriously about our country. And that extended well beyond academics and scholars to the general public. I think we have to look for ways to make that happen. It's not going to be easy. You know, this is also a moment of low self-confidence in our society where people are not eager for a serious discussion of history. I think we have to try, and I think some people will try. I know, for example, that there's going to be a Ken Burns series of documentaries about the Revolutionary War, which I have high hopes for. I think there will be a variety of institutions who try to do this in the right way. But yeah, I've got the same fear you have, which is it's just going to be an opportunity to do what we're already doing, but louder. And that I don't want.
Not only louder, but every cultural institution, from the National Science Foundation to the National Endowments for the Arts and Humanities to the Smithsonian, is pouring effectively billions of dollars into commemorative activity. And it seems to me that that's a form of kerosene that's less likely to bring light than heat. So what should we read to get ready for this? We should read your books. What else should we read to get ready for the 250th?
Well, I think that there's a lot to read that comes to us directly from the founding generation. I think people should read the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Those are short. They're accessible. They're written in plain English for the most part. The Declaration more than the Constitution, but um, I think it's worth becoming more familiar with those. I think if you have a knack for political theory and political arguments, it's really worth reading the Federalist Papers. They're really extraordinary and quite accessible. I think there's also quite a lot of really wonderful American history out there. A lot of it produced over the last 50 years. And people could do worse than to read Gordon Wood and David McCullough and take those books seriously and take the founders seriously. Um, and I do think that there will be some valuable new historical literature created around the 250th, and people should be open to it. But our tradition is exceptionally articulate about itself. There's a lot to read. And so I think approaching it as a reader is the right way to think about it.
But Jefferson said, if you expect to be a nation ignorant and free, you expect what never has been and never can be in the history of civilization. Well, we're testing that proposition right now, and the founding fathers also believed that the only way the republic works is if our leaders have a reasonable amount of civic virtue. They were not fools. They didn't think everybody would be George Washington, but they believed that you have to sign on to a certain idea that's beyond your own narrowest self-interest or those of your tribe, or this thing can't work.
Absolutely. And I think we're testing that in some very dangerous ways now. No question about it.
How about Tocqueville? Should we read Democracy in America?
Absolutely. I love Democracy in America, and I think that it remains an extraordinarily insightful book. it has some blind spots, and it's worth seeing those too. I think Tocqueville could not have imagined abolitionism, for example, which is strange given that he was in America in the 1830s. But there's a lot that he saw about us that remains true and that remains enormously important to understand. And absolutely, he's got to be on your list.
How about The Education of Henry Adams?
A wonderful book. Yeah. I mean, look, I'm with
Tough
you.
sledding, but still.
Yeah. Well, that's right. That's right. But yeah, absolutely.
I'm trying to put together a list of like the 10 books that every American who cares about this conversation should read, and certainly the Federalist Papers, although they bog down a little bit in the middle, but certainly they're accessible. You think of Tocqueville, maybe the best book ever written about us by somebody else. But then if you think of, say, Whitman's Democratic Vistas, I would put in this list. I certainly would put The Education of Henry Adams. Can you think of any 20th century books on the other side of Bowling Alone that would be essential reading to prepare?
Well, I think The Quest for Community is a wonderful book about America. It's related to Bowling Alone in a sense. I mean, it sort of created the communitarian school of sociology and political science, written in 1953 by Robert Nisbet. That's a book I read with students a lot, and it remains amazingly timely. So I'd certainly have that on the list. It's hard for us to be impressed by more recent books. I think books having lasted is part of what makes it impressive. But, there's a lot of good American history and good American political thought being done all the time, and it's worth keeping an eye on it.
We'll have to leave it there for the moment. Thank you so much, Yuval Levin. What a wonderful conversation. We'll see you all next week for another important edition of Listening to America.